Right, so we are recording this, and so if you have any objections to having your image potentially posted publicly, please turn off your screen and refrain from speaking because the recording button is on. Okay, so it's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, and we have two today who are collaborating together. And so I'm going to introduce both of them here at the start, and then they can figure out how they want to divide up their time. Cohen Raleigh became an adjunct professor of writing at Woodbury University in the fall of 2008. She is a journalist by trade who finished college while she was the features editor and columnist for the Antelope Valley Press, a suburban daily newspaper. For 10 years, she wrote stories, managed and mentored reporters, and supervised layout for 14 pages a week, winning awards along the way from the National Newspaper Association, National Newspaper News Executives, Suburban Newspaper Association, and the Associated Press. She's currently teaching the Gothic literature seminar for the writing department. Jennifer Lynn Peterson is professor and chair of the Department of Communication at Woodbury. She is the author of Education in the School of Dreams, Travelogues, and Early Nonfiction Film. And her scholarly articles have been published in such venues as Feminist Media Histories, Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Camera Obscura, The Moving Image, and Getty Research Journal. Peterson's research and teaching interests center on cinema and media history, experimental and educational films, and the environmental humanities. She is currently working on a book entitled Cinema's Ecological Past, Film History, Nature, and Endangerment Before 1960. Please welcome Kim and Jennifer to our CoLA-Verse discussion today, which is on the Gothic in literature and film. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I should start then?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to take about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to give Jennifer 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I do have a short PowerPoint. It has most of my notes on it, which is, I figured rather than looking down, I'd show it to you guys. And I'm in charge of sharing my screen, yes? Okay. Can you guys see that? Linda, are you guys seeing this?
We can see it, Kim.
Okay, great, thanks. I like the meme on Facebook where it's like running one of these things is like running a seance. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, here we go. All right, so all right, Gothic literature and film. Gothic was really the first popular genre. The first Gothic novels were bestsellers, and for a while, Anne Radcliffe, who was the second biggest, or the second chronological Gothic novelist, made more money than any other novelist for decades after she made so much money. So some of them were self-published as chapbooks or in serials, and people just ate it up. And I gave you the handout about the elements, setting in an old castle, an atmosphere of mystery and suspense, ancient prophecies, omen, portents, and visions, supernatural or otherwise inexplicable events, high, even overwrought emotion, women in distress, women threatened by a powerful, impulsive, tyrannical male, and the metonymy of gloom and horror. So the reason that I had you look at Burke's, the little video about Edmund Burke, the philosopher, and his book that he wrote, the philosophical inquiry into the ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, is he was trying to get people to be able to take apart what is merely beautiful. And he was talking mostly about art. And one of the things was the idea of scale. When we look at mountains, it overcomes us. It makes us feel small. And that is the sublime. When we stand on top of a cliff and look down, it's the same thing. It's a different angle, but it's basically the same. One of the people who read this was Horace Walpole. I need to move this. And he's considered the father of Gothic literature. And he likely coined the phrase because he was fond of Gothic architecture, which basically, you know what that is. That's, you know, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, which was a picture that I had, and also Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a Gothic cathedral, and it has lots of space, and it has flying buttresses, because one of the differences between Gothic and other things were what came before it were thin walls. So it had thin walls. And this, what you're looking at, is Strawberry Hill, which was the house that Horace Walpole built for himself. He was building it from 1749 to 1776. Yes, when we were about to have our revolution. So lots of people think that, you know, the Gothic came from the Victorian era, although it was very popular during the Victorian era. That wasn't the beginning of it. And here's a picture of him by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And here is the original Castle of Otranto in 1764. After this got, the conceit was that this was supposedly written hundreds of years ago, and that it was translated from the original Old Italian. And he dropped that after it was so popular, because then he wanted to take credit for it. He was a member of Parliament. He was the son of the very first Prime Minister. And he subtitled it A Gothic Story. And that's where we got that term. So here is Anne Radcliffe, and they called her the Mighty Enchantress. And she wrote the Mysteries of Udolpho in 1794, which she sold the rights for £500, and the Italian in 1797 for £800. So she took the idea of the Gothic, Walpole's idea of the Gothic, which started with a giant, talk about scale, a giant helmet fell on this guy's son and killed him. And that was how the whole thing started. And this gigantic suit of armor comes to life and starts killing people. And she uses the words, the sublime, so many times that I was, you know, I was threatening to count them. But the women in her book had a little bit more agency, not exactly a whole lot, but some, because there was always, you know, usually a virgin in danger. So she had a virgin in danger, but that virgin actually got to marry the man she loved in Mysteries of Udolpho. So, you know, And here's a quote, that in all of her novels, a beautiful and solitary girl is persecuted in picturesque surroundings, and after many fluctuations of fortune, during which she seems again and again on the point of reaching safety, only to be thrust back in the midst of perils, is restored to her friends and marries the man of her choice. And some of that could be because her books were serialized. So, you know, she had to keep everybody on the edge of their seat, so to speak. So then this is about 40 years later, we get Matthew Monk Lewis, and he's another member of Parliament. I don't know what these people do, that they have so much time to be writing books, but he was very influenced by Radcliffe, and they had a discussion about the idea of terror versus horror. And Radcliffe was terror, and that is the feeling that you get in anticipation of being something bad happening to you. That's terror. And horror is when you actually see it. You know, you actually see the head roll off. And at one time, a little later in Gothic, people are absolutely horrified by the French Revolution and you know, all of the heads rolling. And so they have to go even farther to, you know, freak people out. So it gets more and more, you know, gory and terrible things happening. So yeah, in the Monk, everything perversion known at the time was included. Spirits bedding monks, monks committing incest, murder, matricide, evil nuns. And he creates in this the Bleeding Nun tale, which I actually thought was a real, you know, tale, folklore, and actually Lewis invented it. And this picture right here, this is the devil taking the monk off to hell after after the monk has sold his soul to escape justice on earth. So here we have the Romantic era and the Victorian Gothic. So late 1790s is an explosion of Gothic. And just like today's romance novels, people take all these different, you know, conventions, and they just throw it all together and change the names, change the settings, change the, you know, monster, and throw it out there. And there's people to read it. So this is when Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein in 1818, sorry. After having a wild weekend in the country with Lord Byron in Italy. And he throws out there that they should all write stories, and crazy stories, scary stories. And only she, who was 19 at the time, takes up the challenge. And also his doctor, John Polidori, who wrote The Vampire. So those two actually did. So this era includes the Bronte sisters with Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Wilkie Collins' The Women in White, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Henry James' Turn of the Screw, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. American Gothic jumps the pond. We get Edgar Allan Poe, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, Fall of the House of Usher, Nathaniel Hawthorne. I love this picture of him. He's so handsome. We usually see him, you know, old and ugly. William Faulkner, he's under Southern Gothic. And here we have Shirley Jackson with her 4 children. She wrote in between keeping house for her professor husband and dealing with these kids. So Southern Gothic, it changes. It's American. It changes a little. Now we have decaying mansions instead of, old castles. Practically anything by William Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, but particularly A Rose for Emily, which is a story about a Southern belle who, when she dies, they find out that she killed her lover decades before, and she's been sleeping with his dead body since. Almost anything by Flannery O'Connor. Cormac McCarthy, many of the books can be described as Gothic, but especially Blood Meridian. Beloved by Toni Morrison, murdered baby comes back as a temptress to haunt her mother and the house she lives in. Much of Southern Gothic is about being haunted by the past. And Swamplandia by Karen Russell. A Florida family tries to keep their roadside attraction of alligator wrestling and shows open. And her stuff is magical realism, much like the guy who wrote a 100 Years of Solitude. It's escaping me right now. But anyway, my time is up. And so I am going to stop sharing because I want to give Jennifer time to talk about what happens when we start making Gothic films.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes, I can.
I am going to share my screen and put some slides up here for you. Let me first show the video panel so I can see you while I talk and make this big. Okay, so thank you for that great setup. A lot of what happens in the Gothic novel carries over. As you said, Kim, the Gothic is a popular mode, right? But what happens in film is Gothic becomes this kind of, it's not really an umbrella genre. It's sort of like it has certain elements that carry through some specific film genres. Most commonly the horror film, but also the melodrama and also the thriller. And we could also mention science fiction in here as well. So I just have a handful of slides to share with you because obviously I can't go through all of the Gothic films that there are, but what I wanted to set this up with were a few questions that maybe we could consider at the end. And Kim and I had discussed these questions ahead of time. So one of them would be, why is the Gothic such an enduring mode? Why has it carried through for 300 years? Why is it still popular now? One answer I would give to that is because it translates well into pop culture. It's popular, right? So it's really for our post-modernity. And then another question I wanted to raise that Kim and I actually hadn't talked about, but it occurred to me while you were talking, Kim, is the politics of the Gothic, right? Because Sir Edmund Burke was a famous conservative. And I think when you mention the horror that people had at the French Revolution, the heads rolling, I want to also kind of tease out some of the revolutionary potential of the Gothic too. Is this, and this is different from the Sublime, but related to the Sublime. So what is the Gothic's potential for being disruptive or transgressive? And then what are the ways in which the Gothic serves to kind of reassure us or serve as almost a palliative? This is a thing sometimes film scholars talk about, the ways in which when we watch a horror film or say a film with Gothic elements, the horror on the screen or the Gothic elements on the screen are so awful that they kind of serve to, as an inoculation for us, and they serve to like secure the safety and security of the audience sitting in the comfort of the theater or like in the comfort of our home sitting on the couch, right? So we can come back to that. So, okay. Gothic films continue throughout film history. They start with early cinema, they go all the way up to the present, and they continue all of the elements that Kim already set up for you. So in terms of setting, we get, castles. Ruins are really important for the Gothic all throughout history, and the old dark house kind of is a staple of Gothic films and especially of horror films. the atmosphere of, spookiness and mystery and suspense that carries through films. Narrative elements also carry through omens, prophecies, supernatural events, and unexplained events. Characters, women in distress, tyrannical men, and especially monsters. I would say one thing that film history really contributes to the Gothic is an array of really cool monsters that we want to touch upon right here. Another thing to mention, actually, is like something about history as a history of melodrama, because I see melodrama as a kind of umbrella genre under which all these other genres fall, such as horror, such as thriller, such as Gothic. Melodrama, I always talk to my students about this, features a kind of classic triad of characters: the victim, the villain, and the hero. So in the case of Gothic films, or even a lot of the literature, you have the victim is often this woman in distress. The villain is a tyrannical man or a monster of some kind. And then there's the victim, the villain, the hero comes in, and the hero is often a savior man. But not always. We get more and more savior female characters in films today too. But I would point out that even superhero films have this melodramatic triad. So the current spate of superhero big budget blockbusters definitely fits under the category of the melodrama, with spectacles, the melodramatic triad of characters, and then spectacular special effects as well. So film is a pop, and it's melodramatic, and there's a kind of element that runs through a lot of genres of film, such as the horror, the thriller, and so forth. So I just listed a few classic Gothic films. Probably a lot of you have seen many of these. Nosferatu, one of my all-time favorite films by the great F.W. Murnau, should be seen by everyone. Frankenstein, I gave you a couple of clips to watch, and I'll just talk about that in a moment. Directed by James Whale. Dracula, Todd Browning's Dracula is also fantastic. Rebecca is an interesting film. I just taught in my Intro to Film Studies course a few weeks ago, and we had a lot of fun in my class talking about the Gothic elements in Rebecca. And actually I have at least one, maybe two students, Kim, who are also in your Gothic class. So they brought some of the knowledge they learned from your class into my film studies class, and we had a really fun discussion. It was super cool. And then we even talked about the sublime in as a visual element in those of you who know, it's not a Gothic film, really. It's a kind of steampunk sci-fi apocalyptic disaster film. There's all these moments of giant clouds coming forth that feel really sublime. So we did some work to talk about the sublime there too. So anyway, so we watched Rebecca a few weeks ago, and we had a good discussion about the Gothic elements in Rebecca. For those of you who know this film, it begins with a famous voiceover. This is actually the opening image, and then some gates open and the camera tracks inside the ruins of this destroyed mansion, Manderley, and we hear the voiceover, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley." And it's classic Gothic elements there, with the ruined house, the woman who was threatened, the kind of monstrous evil. In this case, the other monster is Mrs. Danvers, a woman. It's very interesting. And of course, there's a remake of Rebecca that has been released on Netflix a few weeks ago, which I have not yet seen. I'm dying to see it. I think it's actually not very good. It's getting pretty bad reviews. That makes me watch it all the more because I think it'll be fun to see how it remakes some of the classic Rebecca elements from the Hitchcock film. Okay, Eyes Without a Face, I've put a little frame grab here on the bottom left from that. I just wanted to throw in a French film by Georges Franju about a crazy doctor whose daughter has an accident, and he tries to give her a face transplant. You can guess how that goes. Then we have an image from Gothic, the Ken Russell film from 1986 in the upper right. And that's a film where the filmmaker stages the evening in which Frankenstein was written. So that's a classic. And then, of course, the Twilight series I wanted to give a shout out to on the bottom right. But there are a lot of other contemporary examples that we can maybe talk about in a few minutes here. And Kim and I gave you a trailer for Lovecraft Country to check out, and we thought we might also talk about that if we have time. So just quickly to touch upon some of the classic Gothic films from the classical Hollywood era, the kind of original monster cycle. I wanted to evoke the great Frankenstein with Boris Karloff as the monster here, who's a classic Gothic monster, of course, made up of different body parts that have been pilfered from the graveyard by the evil doctor. And this is, of course, based on the great Gothic novel by Mary Shelley. Just a year later, the same director, James Whale, who's a really great director, kind of undersung classical Hollywood great, he made The Old Dark House, which makes quite literal this idea of the setting in the old dark house. So this is one way in which maybe we could say that film modernizes the Victorian mode of the Gothic in being somewhat more literal and like kind of pointing at itself, like, look, we're Gothic, you know. Film often does this kind of thing, the over obviousness of it, I think, just of its function as a piece of pop culture, right? And its need to make money. So one thing I wanted to mention actually is that film genre is a really important part of the film industry. It always has been, it still is today. But as early as the 1920s, and certainly by this time in the early 1930s, film genre was really important for studios as a way to market their films, as a way to connect with audiences. So based on the audience's knowledge of previously existing generic elements, such as Gothic elements, such as horror elements, monsters, they could release a film and know that they had a built-in audience of, they didn't use the word fans so much in the day, but they had a built-in audience of fans who would come to see certain genre films. And then, of course, the star system builds upon the genre system. So you get the great monster actors from the 1930s out of this cycle of films. Boris Karloff plays Frankenstein. We also have Bela Lugosi, his rival from the same period. Okay, so just one image from the short clip I gave you to watch from Frankenstein, and this is Karloff here, whose performance in this film is really fantastic because not only is he scary, and he had to put on a lot of makeup and costumes, and he wore big boots that weighed 11 pounds each to kind of create his lumbering walk as he walks across the set. He also has a pathos to him, and I think that's a key to the Gothic monster, is that these monsters are horrifying, and yet somehow they have this compelling element to them that we want to know more about. We find them intriguing and horrible at the same time. So that is really crystallized in this famous scene, which is the second of the two clips I gave you to watch, in which Frankenstein goes up to the young girl and he's trying to make friends with her. Nobody will talk to him because he's scary, of course. So he comes up to the child, and in her beautiful innocence, she says, "Will you play with me?" And so he wants to play with her, and he sees that she's throwing flowers into the water. So he picks her up, thinking that she too is beautiful, and he throws her into the water, and she drowns. And he realizes his mistake when it's too late, and he runs off in horror at his own action, horror at himself. And this is a really great moment in the film, and one of my favorite moments in all of film history, because he is the monster, and yet we feel for him. We feel his pain in this moment, and we know also that he is doomed because of what he just did. So it's a really great way in which the monster's otherness here is utilized in a complex way to create terror, but also sympathy for him as an othered character. Okay, a few other Gothic elements to consider would be, well, we already talked about the sublime, the function of ruins, which relate to the idea of nostalgia. And this sometimes could be thought of as getting at the kind of conservatism of Burke's original idea of the sublime, or other elements of aesthetics, not so much the sublime, this idea that ruins and pasts are in themselves nostalgic and valuable. And yet, this is not inherently conservative. Ruins are fascinating, and they're gone, they're destroyed. So what is it about this destroyed quality of these ruinous settings that's interesting? Monsters and their kind of dual nature as horrifying and compelling, filled with pathos. Also, I should say, in the film cycle of her repeated cycles of Gothic film. Sexuality is very important, and here we could maybe talk about contemporary examples, or even the Twilight series in terms of sexuality. Politics I've raised as an issue. And the environment is one final thing I wanted to end on, just because I'm doing a lot of research on this myself right now. Kim, you had mentioned before Caspar David Friedrich as an important aesthetic model for some of these ideas of the sublime. Here's a really great painting by Caspar David Friedrich called The Sea of Ice, showing an icy Arctic setting outside. So here's a ruin, a shipwreck in an icy Arctic landscape. So this isn't your classic gloomy Gothic forest, rather it's an Arctic landscape. But I would argue that this is somewhat Gothic in terms of the inclusion of the ruin and the horror that is created here. This is a sublime image painted by this great romantic painter. And I am trying to work on ways in which the 1920s and 30s specifically. And I've been working on these glacier films by a scientist, a glaciologist named William O. Field, who made a number of beautiful 35mm films of Alaskan glaciers in the 1920s and 30s. Here's a still image from one of them. These are housed at the Alaska Film Archives, but I think there's an interesting way in which this too has a kind of sublime power to it. This isn't so much Gothic, it's more the sublime. But the point that I'm making in my research is that this now becomes horrible too, as they are melting, right, in the face of climate change. These old films about glaciers that no longer look like this become horrible. They become about this kind of endangerment. So that's a little bit of a tangent there. Those are the end of my slides, so let me stop sharing my screen and we can come back out to the larger discussion here. Stop share. One last thing to mention is that in film, genre films like horror, like even melodramatic women's films, are usually considered more popular. Like, these are not the art films, these are the pop culture films. They are not often the ones nominated for Academy Awards, for example. Those are usually the dramas, right, or the tragedies. So another thing to think about might be the Gothic status as a popular form. And perhaps that has something to do with its enduring appeal, especially now when we don't so much separate pop culture and art anymore. But just to mention, for example, there's very rarely genre films nominated for Academy Awards. Get Out was nominated a few years ago in 2017, a horror film, but that was rare. And of course it didn't win for Best Picture. And even the nomination of Get Out, a horror film, was controversial among Academy members, because a lot of the Academy members, the older ones, said things like, well, this isn't really Academy material, it's a genre film, right? So I wanted to mention that as a way of thinking about, that's a horror film, but it has Gothic elements in it. It has an old dark house in it, as a way of getting at this idea of the Gothic as a popular form, which to me is a good thing, is an asset. Okay, so that's what I had to say. I look forward to the discussion.
I just wanted to say a couple things. The Caspar David Friedrich painting that you showed, it looks much like the Arctic scene in Frankenstein in the book, where they go after him.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, he, of course, never went to the Arctic, but he was inspired by a real Arctic expedition that took place in 1819, 1820. So much like Anne Radcliffe, who wrote Mysteries of Udolpho set in Italy without ever traveling there.
Right.
Caspar David Friedrich is painting this stunning landscape without ever having been there. So these are people kind of fantasizing about other lands, right, and making this genre out of them.
Well, you know, I normally never chime in about my past scholarship, but I'm going to make an exception here because I've been always very interested in the end of Frankenstein. And as most of you know, it culminates in the Arctic. In fact, the entire book it takes place in the Arctic, actually. It's all framed within the book literally takes place in the cabin of a ship. But at any rate, Frankenstein is pursuing the creature toward the North Pole. And of course, we're accustomed to thinking of it as a hostile, inhumane environment, epitomizing something like the sublime. But we know from reading Mary Shelley's journals that while she was writing Frankenstein, she was reading a novel by Louis Holberg, who is a Dano-Norwegian writer, who wrote this fanciful kind of journey to the center of the earth novel about someone who goes to the North Pole and goes down into the earth and discovers this alternative world inside the earth, like Jules Verne. But unlike our world on the surface, this is a very humane, accepting, beautiful place where somebody like the creature could live without the kind of prejudice that he experienced as a victim among humans. And so as soon as I discovered that, I just had a whole different feeling about the culmination of Frankenstein. It was a very happy ending for me after I realized these things.
I was just noting in the chat, Ruben, that you mentioned that image from the film Gothic looks like Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, which it is. It's an homage to that. And then I see, Matt, you said you can see it at the Detroit Institute of Art. It's cool. I've never seen that famous painting. And there's kind of an interesting theme running through our discussion here about the exchange between literature, film, and painting.
Yeah, and a really quick shout out too I'll give is and Jennifer, you mentioned the movie Nosferatu, and I've always enjoyed the movie The Shadow of the Vampire. I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah, that's a very interesting take on the filming of Nosferatu, which is really enjoyable. I always try to make time to watch it once in a while. I had this question too, and I don't know if you saw it up there, but we were talking about astrology earlier. And it's got me thinking, like, is anyone aware of the relationship between the origin of Gothic lit and its focus on horror, fear, and other emotions, and the rise of psychology? And psychology, just for me, it seems to straddle its origins, that border between enlightenment, rationality, and romanticism. And I'm just curious. I have no idea, like, if anyone's explored that relationship or knows of anything about that, or if there is a relationship at all. Maybe there isn't.
No, there is. And when you get to Poe is very psychological. I mean, a lot of the horror is psychological, and that was just at the time when we start looking at what goes on inside of our heads. And then I'm teaching Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. Wow. And that is hugely psychological, because at some point they're going, is Eleanor creating all of this chaos in the house? Is she, creating these poltergeist experiences? Because she got invited to the haunted house because it rained hail or stones for 3 days at her house. And this was written up in papers, and that's why the doctor invited her to be there, because, she had this experience with the paranormal.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I didn't know what the protocol was. Okay, so one of the things that I find really interesting is that it seems like maybe this isn't true, but it seems like that when there are things going on in the world that are causing such unrest, such anxiety, whether it's a war or the French Revolution or a pandemic or whatever it is, that there seems to be a surge in more of these genre films being made and more interest in the Gothic at that time. And I was wondering if that's true. And I was also wondering if it was because the thing that's really interesting about Gothic is it sets you up to look at a world that's very unsettled in some way, unnatural in some way, and then you go through all of this action and problems, but ultimately at the end there's a resolution, and generally the resolution is to return things to some kind of normalcy. And so I was just wondering what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, well, in film studies, actually, that's a major thing that film scholars always talk about, how a genre film, say like a Gothic or a horror film, has all of these disruptive, transgressive elements, but often just through the functioning of narrative closure, some of those elements are shut down at the end and we have a resolution. But then the question becomes, what do we remember most as an audience remember? Do you remember the monster and all the trouble that was caused? Yeah. And you remember the villains, and you remember, like in film noir, you remember the bad girl, who's causing all the trouble. And then when it's all closed off at the end, yes, there is a kind of reimposition of the social order there. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But
that gives the audience a relief from the tensions that they're having in their own culture or their own life.
Precisely, and it like temporarily solves the problem on the screen that's not solved in real life.
Right, exactly. And then the other question I had was, where does Cocteau's film Beauty and the Beast, does that fit anywhere in the genre? I mean, it has some of the elements, but not all of the elements, and it was happening during World War II. Yeah. And the film was actually put together with, basically borrowed sheets and stuff.
I know, I love that film.
Gorgeous images that are.
Oh God, yeah, I love that film. This Cocteau's film, Beauty and the Beast, I would say is not so much a Gothic film, although it has Gothic elements to it, but it's a fantasy film. It's usually considered a kind
and it's very romantic.
Yeah, and it's romantic as well. Yeah, and it stands alone because Cocteau is
so with a maiden and a beast.
Yeah,
as well.
Fairy tale.
Confused as to where it would belong.
Yeah, it's an art film, so it doesn't fit the commercial genre categories the way Frankenstein or, The Old Dark House or like Hollywood products meant to fit a kind of genre niche. Whereas Cocteau, he's operating over here in his own special realm of art.
I had a question for both of you guys. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I stand to learn more. Can't wait to read your book, Jennifer.
Yeah, I gotta write it first.
I know. It's all right. We're patient.
I'm working on it. Yeah.
No pressure. So, I've been in a Karl Marx reading group. Call me a fool. So every 2 weeks, it's a global reading group, and it's been fascinating. But there's a lot of references to vampires and basically Gothic lore. And it's, the middle of the 19th century. And of course, it's sociology, philosophy, and economics, and it has nothing to do with literature, or at least ostensibly not. But I was wondering, because I've always thought of, the genre, I've always thought of a subtle critique on the mechanicity of the industrial revolution. I mean, the sort of, putting a creature together from different parts, and basically also the alienation, right? The internal alienation that the workers in these factories in the late 18th century, early 19th century were experiencing. So I think it actually flows very nicely with the sort of the Marxist critique from the 19th century. But I was wondering if you think that this actually translates into contemporary Gothic film and literature, right? Maybe Edward Scissorhands is also of many things. It's also a critique of sort of mid-century capitalism. But I wonder what you guys think.
You want to take that, Kim?
No, Jennifer, you go.
So yeah, maybe not Edward Scissorhands, but we could come up with other examples where, yeah, absolutely, the Gothic is doing this work of critiquing the conditions of labor and the conditions of the worker under capitalism. I'm also in a Marxist reading group, funnily enough.
Well, not in mine. I wish you were in mine.
Oh, I'll join yours. A lot of them these days, which is cool. But yeah, absolutely. I think there are so many films that portray the plight of the worker and I'm gonna have to like come up with some examples now because all the ones I can. Sorry, yeah, Metropolis. Absolutely, yeah. But even contemporary films, popular films, right, where we can think about the alienation of the worker. These are often not in Gothic terms, though. But let me think on that while you guys talk.
Yeah, about that though, there's definitely fear of the Industrial Revolution in Frankenstein, in the book. You know, I mean, not only is it, you know, the hubris of man, but it's also, you know, how do we fit ourselves into this society that's becoming more and more mechanized. And I'm sure that there's other examples that I just haven't seen yet. There's a couple questions.
Yeah, Emily's asking a question about race in the chat box and how it functions in the Gothic. And I just wanted to mention that, you know, I've been teaching Claudia Rankin's Citizen for a while now. And it's a book about the contemporary racial context in this country, and she quite explicitly has a reproduction of Fuseli's painting in the middle of that book. I mean, it's an image in her book, and it's updated, and it's, you know, in an African American context, but she's clearly racializing the Gothic. And so I don't know if you all want to talk about that a little bit.
Well,
so in other words, the imp is the white person sitting on the black person's chest.
Yeah, it's very Africanized in the image in her book, but it's there, and it's in the section of night where she's talking about nightmares. And in fact, the page is blacked out, and so the image is in white on a black surface. It's just very incredibly striking.
What was the book you're referring to?
I'm sorry, what? The book?
Yeah, what was the book?
I'll put it in the chat. It's Citizen by Claudia Rankin.
Thank you.
Jim, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't Lovecraft Country a prime example of what you were just talking about?
Yeah, which is why we wanted to talk about it, although I didn't get a chance to watch it yet. So Kim, you've seen it. You should talk about it.
Yeah, I've seen it. And it's, you know, H.P. Lovecraft was a notorious racist. And, you know, it's not in every story. It's not in every book, but it is pretty clear. And just like the Southern Gothic, I couldn't find a short story that didn't have the N-word in it. So I had to, you know, put a statement in my syllabus, hey, you were going to have to deal with this, because, you know, I couldn't find anything that didn't have it in it, because it was an everyday part of speech when these people were writing. And so Lovecraft Country is based on a novel, and what they've done is they've taken, it's an all-black cast except for a few white people, and they're dealing with Lovecraft storylines. One thing that I didn't say is that there's a lot of lineage in Gothic, you know, people getting things handed down to them. And so this black man finds out that he is, because he was the son of a slave, that he is the inheritor of this secret, and he's at the middle of this secret society, which is all old white men.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really intense. And then there is a house, because the one girl, buys a boarding house to, a big, mansion, and starts renting out rooms. And then of course all of the, white people are trying to drive her out of the neighborhood. So it kind of brings up the question, what's scarier? The monsters, because there are Lovecraftian monsters. We haven't seen Cthulhu, but we have seen other, monsters, or these white people who are trying to kill them because they have to travel through sundown towns where, you had to be out of town by sundown. And so there's all kinds of racial issues involved in this thing. Has anybody seen it? No?
I've been watching a few episodes, yeah.
Yeah. And what did you think, Matt?
So it's been a while since I've read Lovecraft, and I was a person who was never that big of a fan of his. I mean, it just didn't really sit well with me, I guess, as a reader. And I think the TV series in general is interesting, the take that they're doing. But I should also point out that, unlike most people, even though I live in Tinseltown here, I'm not that big of a fan of miniseries or streamings. And so, I had to kind of drag myself to watch some of the episodes. But it has its moments where they're pretty good. I think most people would overall enjoy it. And I think in terms of the racial commentary, I just got to sit on it for a while and try to figure out, what's exactly going on there.
Yeah. Rita, did you have something to say? I'm sorry. It looked like you were going to talk.
No.
Oh.
But I was thinking about the show Dark Shadows from the 60s.
Yes.
During this conversation, but it's not highbrow stuff.
It doesn't have to be highbrow stuff. It isn't all.
It's supposed to be.
Hey, I'm one of the kids who raced home from school to watch it. So.
Oh, were you? I was,
well, 5.
I probably watched, I'm sure I watched the repeats in the 80s, but I also raced home from school to watch it.
Oh, so you watched the one with Ben Cross, the remake?
No, not the remake, but they played it again later. Because I think originally it was aired in the 60s.
Yeah.
But I think in the 80s they ran it again on TV.
And it was on, it was like a soap opera. It was on in the afternoon.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm the old guy here, and I watched it when it first came out, and it was pretty mind-blowing. I mean, there was nothing like it. Because it kind of falls back to what Jennifer was talking about earlier with the nature of genre fiction or film. It played with expectations and conventions, but then subverted them by taking the format of a daytime soap opera and making it spooky and gothic. It was cool.
And there was humor in it as well.
Oh, it had to have it.
Sometimes it was unintentional humor.
Right. They made a lot of mistakes and they just kept rolling because it was live.
Yeah.
Actually, my husband and I just sat in on a reunion show with the original cast members. And I don't know if you remember Angelique, who was like the main villain. Yeah. She was saying that she would ride home on the subway afterwards because it was filmed in New York. And all the kids on the subway would, be horrified and go to the other side of the subway because they were so scared because it had such a huge kid fan base.
Yeah, for sure. Well, she wasn't in her makeup, was she?
I don't know. I don't think so, but
hopefully they had a dressing room so she could at least, change her costume.
A few years ago, they had a convention at the Marriott in Burbank, and my husband and I went, and we got to meet Jonathan Frid, who was Barnabas, which was a lot of fun, but he's since passed.
Right. recently, right? Or
Yeah, just a few
last
years
year or
ago.
so? Okay.
Any other questions for our discussion leaders? We're almost out of time, but
So I hesitate to ask it, but is the pandemic a Gothic landscape?
well, that's of course the next question, right?
Yeah, maybe.
It's full of thorns and spikes and sharps and
And we're all stuck in our home.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the home is not the spooky place. The home is the safe place in the pandemic.
True, true. Yeah. But you never know.
Unless you are a victim of domestic violence. And
Yeah.
then,
Well, okay, yes, right.
yeah.
Mhm.
Right, or you're finding out that your relationships aren't
Yeah.
as good as you thought they were.
Yeah.
I apologize for asking the question.
No, but it will be interesting to see what kind of literature or art comes out of it in the future.
Well, the monster gets completely internalized, right? In the pandemic, right?
Either that or our elected officials.
Hopefully that's going to work itself out. Hopefully. Oh, there is one more thing that I wanted to say because I thought it was funny. When Jennifer was talking about ruins, what I didn't say is that during that time of the after Castle of Otranto came out, it was very popular to have ruins on your estate. So some people were actually building ruins. They didn't have them, but, they would find, stones and they would, pay to bring them to make this pile of rubble on their estate so that they could have ruins of their own.
Perfectly reasonable.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. I
All
appreciate
right.
it. And thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Kim, so
Thank
much
you, Linda. Thank you,
for
Kim.
bringing this to all of us today. And we really appreciate it. And this is actually the last CoLA-Verse of the calendar year.
Saving the best for last.
That's right. Yeah. And so we will reconvene in the new year.
Okay.
Whatever
Linda,
that means.
Linda, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's just one practical question in the chat. Someone asked if this video will be available to watch later.
Yes, it will be. It's going to be part of our YouTube channel library. So yes.
Excellent.
Okay.
So thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.